Greetings, my name is Stephen Myers, and as the title suggests, this video is about questions that you won't answer if you believe the Orion Correlation Theory. I didn't say the questions are unanswerable, or have no answer, or can't be answered. I am saying that you won't answer the questions if you believe the Orion Correlation Theory. Now, if you don't believe the Orion Correlation Theory, the questions in this video are rather easy to answer. In fact, very easy. In this video, I will present a series of questions that will not be answered by people who believe the Orion Correlation Theory. Then I will explain what the series of questions have in common, which causes people who believe the Orion Correlation Theory to refuse to answer these questions. Then I will describe why people who believe the Orion Correlation Theory refuse to answer these questions. I hope you watch the entire video. As always, manning the control booth is Harley, my good friend and associate. Being in the control booth, if things get out of control, it's Harley's fault. You can handle the pressure, can't you, Harley? He says he can handle it, so we are ready to go. There is a lot of information to cover, and we will have some fun along the way. So let's get started and do this thing. Let's start with an easy question. It is a really good question to get things rolling. Now remember, if you believe the Orion Correlation Theory, you won't answer this question or the following questions in this video. Believers of the Orion Correlation Theory might offer up some verbiage or say some words or try to change the subject, or provide a wrong answer, or get mad and hurl insults. But in reality, none of that is actually answering the question. So here's the question. Can a Great Pyramid correlation be invalid? That's a simple, straightforward question. It could be answered with a yes, and it could be answered with a no. But if you believe the Orion Correlation Theory, you will not answer the question either way. You especially won't answer the question when you know the next question is, how is your answer determined? But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Believe it or not, if you believe the Orion Correlation Theory, you won't provide a coherent answer to the question, can a Great Pyramid correlation be invalid? No answer or articulate conversation will result from that question if you are a believer of the Orion Correlation Theory. Let's move on. I will make a statement. A Great Pyramid correlation can be invalid. Here is the next question. Is that statement on the screen that I just said true or false? If you don't believe the Orion Correlation Theory, the question is very easy to answer. If you happen to believe the Orion Correlation Theory, that means you are very uncomfortable with that question and you will not answer the question. You can't say the statement is true and you can't say the statement is false. Hey, Harley, can you answer the question? Harley says that's an easy question to answer. That means Harley doesn't believe the Orion Correlation Theory. Harley, I know you don't believe the Orion Correlation Theory. I was just making sure the viewers know. Let's switch things up and ask a question that people who believe the Orion Correlation Theory will actually try to respond to. I didn't say answer. The Orion Correlation Theory believers will provide wrong answers to the following question, but will not provide a correct answer. Here is the question. Is there a feature specific to the Great Pyramid which indicates the builders intended the Great Pyramid to have anything to do with Orion? If you believe the Orion Correlation Theory, you will gladly provide many wrong answers to that question. Orion Correlation Theory believers say a Great Pyramid vent is pointing to Orion, and maybe even show a picture of a Great Pyramid vent pointing to Orion. Spoiler alert, no vent is pointing to Orion. All the vents of the Great Pyramid are pointing away from Orion. That is a fact. If you believe the Orion Correlation Theory, you probably don't even know that. Why would you? The precession of the equinoxes, or better termed the grand precession, results in the sky moving about 1 degree every 72 years. So no vent is pointing towards Orion, not even close. The vent pointing towards Orion is a wrong answer to the question. So people who believe the Orion Correlation Theory then provide another wrong answer. They say, well, the vent did in the past point to Orion, and that means the builders intended a relationship between the Great Pyramid and Orion. What they are saying is, if the vent used to point to a star, such as Orion, then that means it was intended to point to that feature in the sky for some significant reason, because it did point to that star in the past. People who believe the Orion Correlation Theory will nod their head emphatically. Because of the grand precession, the vents have pointed to many different stars in the past and will point to various other stars in the future. So the next question is, if a vent used to point to a star means there is an intended correlation between the vent and the star, then is every star the vents have ever pointed to somehow profoundly significant? No coherent answer to that question is forthcoming from people who believe the Orion Correlation Theory. So even people who believe the Orion Correlation Theory don't really think of a vent used to point to a star. That is what makes the supposed star-vent correlation profoundly significant. Orion Correlation Theory believers will still try to answer the question with yet another wrong answer. They will say, well, you will have to go back to when the Great Pyramid was built to see which significant stars the Great Pyramid vents were supposed to point to. Really? That answer brings up another question. It is an important question. If pointing to significant stars determines the date of construction, and the date of construction tells us what significant stars the vents were supposed to point to, is that an example of circular reasoning? That's a legitimate question to ask. Absolutely no coherent answer to that question will be provided by anyone who believes the Orion Correlation Theory. If you, the viewer, won't answer that question, it means you believe the Orion Correlation Theory. Now, other people can answer that question without any problem. Here is a quote from the book Stargate Conspiracy, in which they provide an excellent answer to that question. I will read the quote. Quote, however, some of Bavall's assumptions are open to question. For example, he presents a very circular argument that uses the stellar alignments of the shafts to prove the date of the Great Pyramid, but also relies on this date to prove that the shafts have stellar alignments. This is classic circular reasoning, unquote. The quote is a wonderful, straightforward answer to the following question. If pointing to stars determines the date of construction, and the date of construction tells us what stars the vents were supposed to point to, is that an excellent example of circular reasoning? Here's another fun question to ask. Is the book's answer to the question valid or invalid? If you, the viewer, believe the Orion Correlation Theory, you won't answer that question either. Harley, is the star vent stuff an example of circular reasoning? Harley says yes, it is. Wow, that is a straightforward and correct answer. Thank you, Harley. Now, how refreshing it is to get a straight-up answer to a straight-up question. That doesn't happen when talking to an Orion Correlation Theory believer. All of this gets us back to the question, is there a feature specific to the Great Pyramid which indicates the builders intended any relationship between the Great Pyramid and Orion? Orion Correlation Theory believers will provide yet another wrong answer to that question. They start blabbering with this story. Well, if you look at the three major pyramids on the Giza Plateau and then compare them to the belt of Orion, they look alike and shazam! It's a correlation. That's a very wrong answer to the question. Newsflash! Other pyramids are not a feature specific to the Great Pyramid. Those other pyramids are not features specific to the Great Pyramid, so if your answer includes any mention of other pyramids, you are gladly providing a wrong answer to the question. It is just that simple. As you can see, if you, the viewer, believe the Orion Correlation Theory, you are very comfortable with wrong answers. Why that is will be explained later in this video. So the vents pointing away from Orion and the blabbering about other pyramids and denying circular reasoning are all unacceptable and rejected answers to the question, is there a feature specific to the Great Pyramid which indicates the builders intended any relationship between the Great Pyramid and Orion? If you, the viewer, believe the Orion Correlation Theory, it means you won't answer the question on the screen in any coherent manner. You can't say yes and you can't say no. Isn't that interesting? It is to me, but let's move on. Let's look at it another way. I'll make a statement. There is no feature specific to the Great Pyramid which indicates the builders intended any relationship between the Great Pyramid and Orion. Here's our next question. Is that statement I just said true or false? You won't answer that question if you believe the Orion Correlation Theory. If you answer true, then that will threaten the fake correlations you have embraced. If you answer false, you know the next question will be, what is that feature? You definitely will not provide a coherent answer to that question. So that means if you believe the Orion Correlation Theory, you won't answer the question. You can't say true and you can't say false. If you don't believe the Orion Correlation Theory, these questions are very rudimentary and simple to answer. If you happen to believe the Orion Correlation Theory, these questions make you very apprehensive and uncomfortable. We will discuss why that is later. There are so many other questions you won't answer if you believe the Orion Correlation Theory. Let's move on to another question Orion Correlation Theory believers won't answer. Does precision validate a correlation? I love that question. If you believe the Orion Correlation Theory, you think the answer is yes. In your mind, the answer is yes, but you won't say the answer. You see a correlation that is perceived as being precise, and you think the perceived precision validates the correlation. But even though you think the answer is yes, if you believe the Orion Correlation Theory, you won't actually answer the question. You won't say yes, and you won't say no. Isn't that interesting? It is to me. Now, if you talk to any trained researcher who doesn't care a hoot about pyramids and ask the question, does precision validate a correlation? You will get a resounding no for an answer. Do you want to know why someone who does not believe the Orion Correlation Theory answers no to that question? People who are actually trained in conducting research know that precision does not validate a correlation. Trained researchers who don't care at all about pyramids, who conduct legitimate academic research, know that precision does not validate a correlation. Let's go over a few examples of precise correlations that are not valid. The vents of the Great Pyramid are pointing to stars right now very precisely. There are a lot of stars in the sky, and the vents are pointing precisely to what some would consider to be non-significant stars right now. Are those precise star-vent correlations that exist right now intended to be profoundly significant? No coherent response is provided by someone who believes that precision validates a correlation or who believes the Orion Correlation Theory. How about the precise correlation between the United States spending on science, space, and technology with the number of suicides by hanging, strangulation, and suffocation? Is that precise correlation valid or invalid? All trained researchers know that that example of a precise correlation is invalid, but if you believe the Orion Correlation Theory, you can't say yes, it is valid, or no, it is invalid. This is because you think precision validates a correlation, but in the realm of legitimate academic research, precision does not validate a correlation. How about the precise correlation between the number of people who have drowned by falling into a pool compared with the number of films Nicolas Cage appeared in? Is that precise correlation valid or invalid? All trained researchers know that example of a precise correlation is invalid, but if you believe the Orion Correlation Theory, you can't say yes, it is valid, or no, it is invalid. This is because you think precision validates a correlation, but in the realm of legitimate academic research, precision does not validate a correlation. How about the precise correlation between per capita cheese consumption and the number of people who died by becoming tangled in their bed sheets? Is that precise correlation valid or invalid? Everyone knows that example of a precise correlation is invalid, but if you believe the Orion Correlation Theory, you can't say yes, it is valid, or no, it is invalid. This is because you think precision validates a correlation, but in the realm of legitimate academic research, precision does not validate a correlation. These precise correlations have charts and graphs and everything. But Orion Correlation Theory believers can't say these precise correlations are invalid, and they can't say they are valid. There are many more examples of precise correlations that are invalid. Go to the link below to find more information about these and many more examples of precise but invalid correlations. In fact, all invalid correlations are precise. That fact has important implications and is quite interesting. Let's move on to more questions you won't answer if you believe the Orion Correlation Theory. Does math validate a correlation? If you, the viewer, believe the Orion Correlation Theory, you will not answer that question with a yes, and you will not answer that question with a no. In the realm of legitimate research, math does not validate a correlation, but people who believe the Orion Correlation Theory think if the numbers of two things seem the same or somehow match up, then Shazam, it's a correlation. Let's look at some examples. The Beatles had 4 members, and the Great Pyramid has 4 sides. The numbers match up. The correlation is mathematically precise. Is the mathematically precise Beatles pyramid sides correlation valid? That's a tough question for people who believe the Orion Correlation Theory. They might say it is rubbish, or they might say the Beatles came after the Great Pyramid, so it is an invalid correlation. Oh, well, the Great Pyramid came after Orion, so does that mean the Great Pyramid has nothing to do with Orion? No coherent answer to that question will be forthcoming. It seems that when pressed, they don't really believe that if something came first, then that means the correlation is invalid. No rational conversation will occur with someone who believes the Orion Correlation Theory when asking these questions. To me, that is interesting and very telling, but more about that later. Sometimes an Orion correlation theory believer might try to get cute and say the Great Pyramid has 8 sides, so the correlation is not mathematically precise, therefore, lacking mathematical precision, the correlation is invalid. Wow, that is simple to address. Each of the 4 sides of the Great Pyramid is divided into 2 parts. Each of the 4 Beatles were both singers and musicians. Shazam! The original builders of the Great Pyramid told us about the Beatles in such a mathematically precise and profoundly symbolic way. Instead of having a coherent conversation, an Orion correlation theory believer would say that the Great Pyramid has a base, which would be a 5th side. So that means the correlation is not mathematically precise and therefore invalid. But hey, there was a 5th Beatle. Double Shazam! You know, people can make up mathematically precise correlations all day long about anything. Just like I have done between the Beatles and the Great Pyramid. No big deal at all. In the realm of legitimate research, mathematical precision does not validate a correlation. Here is a mathematically precise correlation that has been bandied about on the internet, forums, and other places. The theorized correlation is between the coordinates of the Great Pyramid and the speed of light. It is perceived to be mathematically precise correlation, but trust me, that does not make it valid. Pictures like this show up on Facebook a lot, and some contend that the mathematical precision validates the correlation. But what about this picture? The coordinates of the Great Pyramid are the same, and the speed of light is the same. Neither of these 2 things changed. While viewing this picture on the screen, a good question to ask is there a mathematically precise correlation between the coordinates of the Great Pyramid and the speed of light? Ask that question to an Orion correlation theory believer, and they are like, oh, hubba hubba hubba, or they'll start saying, yeah, but, yeah, but, yeah, but. And then they say a bunch of incoherent sequences of words, but don't really answer the question. Oh, by the way, the many Great Pyramid Bible correlations that have been made up are mathematically precise. If you don't even know about the many precise Great Pyramid Bible correlations, look up pyramidology or pyramid inch or the Bethlehem angle. Lots of thick books have been written about the many mathematically precise correlations between the Great Pyramid and the Bible. I often refer to this collection of precise correlations as the biblical correlation theory. Here's a fun question to ask someone who believes the Orion correlation theory. Are the mathematically precise Great Pyramid Bible correlations valid or invalid? They will not provide a straight up coherent answer. They will not say yes, and they will not say no. Especially when they know the next question would be, how is your answer determined? There is an answer to all of these questions, but they won't say the answer, and no coherent conversation will result from any of these questions. The reason why will be addressed later in the video. Let's move on to another question. What is causation? Wow, that's a powerful question. Very powerful for sure. I use that question when some pesky believer of the Orion correlation theory is yammering about made-up fake Great Pyramid correlations someone made up that he embraces. That question sure shuts them up big time. If you, the viewer, believe the Orion correlation theory, it means you will not answer that question. That question will force you to shut your mouth. Orion correlation theories are not equipped or have the training to answer that question at all. This is because they have read books about the Orion correlation theory, which is a collection of correlations, but those books are absolutely devoid of causation. If you don't believe me, ask Robert Bauval. He wrote whole books about perceived Great Pyramid correlations, and named a theory with the word correlation in the title, but the books are devoid of any discussion of causation. Even this high priest of the Orion Correlation Theory mystery religion doesn't talk about causation. Hey Harley, why did you put that funny hat on the picture? Oh, I get what you're saying. Anyone who writes a whole book about correlations but can't discuss causation deserves to have a funny hat. Oh, Harley, you are such a card and very insightful. Here's another related question. Does causation matter? Wow, ask that question to an Orion Correlation Theory believer, and this is what will happen. They would rather have their head explode than answer that question. But ask that question to any trained researcher who doesn't care at all about pyramids, and you will get a very coherent answer to that question. Does causation matter? In reality, no one even pretends that the Great Pyramid correlations of the Orion Correlation Theory even have causation. They don't know about causation. They don't care about causation. And they won't talk about causation. Do you think it is strange that Orion Correlation Theory believers consider themselves to be researchers who believe a correlation theory, but they don't give a hoot about causation? I think it is strange and a harbinger of things to come. Here's another question Orion Correlation Theory believers won't answer. Are there invalid research methods? Orion Correlation Theory believers are terrified of that question and are even more terrified of the answer. That is why Orion Correlation Theory believers will never answer that question. They will never say yes, and they will never say no, because if they do, then they know that would follow. What would follow is a discussion comparing different types of research methods and identifying which are valid and which are invalid research methods. No matter what, Orion Correlation Theory believers will never allow that conversation to occur. Here is the flip side of the previous question. Are there valid research methods? If Orion Correlation Theory believers can't answer the previous question, they certainly can't answer this question either. They can't say yes and they can't say no. If they did answer the question, then a discussion of research methods would commence, but they will never discuss research methods because for them it is a forbidden subject. Orion Correlation Theory believers can't say yes, there are valid research methods, and can't say no, there are not valid research methods. It is bizarre but true. Phrenology is the science which compares the bumps on people's heads with various character traits. Phrenology is essentially a collection of correlations between head bumps and character traits. I call phrenology the bump correlation theory. Here's a really fun question to ask someone who believes the Orion Correlation Theory. Are the correlations of phrenology valid or invalid? Even though phrenology has been rejected, and even though phrenology is a very racist and false belief system passed off as a science, people who believe the Orion Correlation Theory are very hesitant and apprehensive about answering that question. They might say phrenology is rubbish, and it is, but that is about all you will get from an Orion Correlation Theory believer. No detailed explanations will be forthcoming from an Orion Correlation Theory believer, and in reality, they will do anything to avoid the question. Why is phrenology invalid? There is an answer to that question, but you won't get an answer from an Orion Correlation Theory believer. So let's get into the nitty-gritty with the last question we will explore. There are many more questions Orion Correlation Theory believers won't answer, but I think we have addressed a good representative set of examples. If you believe the Orion Correlation Theory, you won't answer this following question. Can a Great Pyramid correlation be valid? Wow. That question is the flip side of a question we already covered. That earlier question was, can a Great Pyramid correlation be invalid? But now we are asking, can a Great Pyramid correlation be valid? Oh, I love both of those questions. If you believe the Orion Correlation Theory, both of those questions won't be answered. You won't say yes and you won't say no as an answer to the question, can a Great Pyramid correlation be valid? You won't say no because that would threaten the fake correlation that you embrace. You won't say yes because you know if you do say yes, the next question would be, how is the validity of a Great Pyramid correlation determined? If you believe the Orion Correlation Theory, you will never ever answer that question, ever. As always, an Orion Correlation Theory believer will offer up verbiage or hurl insults or try to change the subject or even utter some incoherent yammering, but they will never answer the questions we have covered, even when they know they will be compelled to answer those questions. When you hold their feet to the fire, they still won't answer those questions. So, what is going on? What is the common thread to all of these diverse questions? Why do Orion Correlation Theory believers have difficulty with these seemingly simple questions? Why is there an aversion to Orion Correlation Theory believers to answering these questions? What is going on? Oh, why? Oh, why won't they answer these questions? Although it is not immediately obvious, all of these questions are related because they all address the same subject. All of these questions, either directly or indirectly, address the subject of research methods. Orion Correlation Theory believers do not want to and will not discuss the subject of research methods. It is a forbidden subject. I produced a video titled The Orion Correlation Theory and the Forbidden Subject, and it is on my YouTube channel. The link for that video is in the description of this video. When I say research methods, I use that term with a very broad definition. To me, research methods includes data collection, but also how that data is analyzed. How data is analyzed to produce interpretations is a research method. Some use the alternative term standards of evidence, which is okay too. Research methods is the methods used to conduct research and the analysis of the data collected to produce explanations of direct physical evidence. I'll let the nitpickers worry about what they think the term research methods means and what activities are included in that term. I think any method a researcher uses to collect data and analyze data are methods to conduct research. Since we discussed the meaning of the term research methods and mentioned standards of evidence, I'll ask another question just for fun. Are there high standards of evidence and low standards of evidence? It is a straightforward question that can be answered with a yes or a no. But if you believe the Orion Correlation Theory, you won't answer that question because if you do, you know the next question is, what are high standards of evidence and what are low standards of evidence? If you believe the Orion Correlation Theory, you will never answer that question because, for you, discussing research methods is forbidden. Yet, here is a quote from this guy that at least acknowledges there are both high standards of evidence and low standards of evidence. In the quote, he admonishes people who use low standards of evidence and says to guard against using low standards of evidence. He also advocates the importance of using high standards of evidence. That is a very fascinating quote that is intriguing in many ways with far-reaching implications. With that quote in mind, it is astounding to me that people who believe the Orion Correlation Theory will not answer the questions we covered and many other questions related to standards of evidence or research methods or scholarly techniques. In contrast to the quote on the screen, Orion Correlation Theory believers absolutely refuse to allow or participate in any discussion that even touches on how research is conducted or the subject of standards of evidence. Yet, every researcher in every other field of study wants to discuss his research any chance that presents itself. The second most important subject of all researchers who do not believe the Orion Correlation Theory is the subject of research methods. As astounding as it seems to Orion Correlation Theory believers, the subject and application of valid research methods is pivotal to the conducting of valid research. In other words, real researchers who do not believe the Orion Correlation Theory, who conduct valid research, want to discuss their research and want to discuss the methods and procedures they use to produce their research. A researcher produces research, but researchers must provide a detailed explanation of how their research is produced. Let's put it this way. Researchers produce answers, but even teachers understand that when answers or research is presented, one must show their work. Teachers understand the importance of showing your work. The work must be shown to determine if the process used to attain their answers are valid or not. But Orion Correlation Theory believers refuse to even talk about the methods or scholarly procedures or standards of evidence they use to come up with their answers or research. Answering the questions I discussed earlier in this video would open up a discussion of the methods or procedures they used to get answers based on their research. The question is why? Why won't people who believe the Orion Correlation Theory ever answer questions that even touch on the subject of research methods? To follow our teacher analogy, why won't Orion Correlation Theory believers show their work or their research methods they use to come up with their findings? Simply put, why won't Orion Correlation Theory believers show their work? The question is why? Why won't Orion Correlation Theory believers discuss research methods or standards of evidence? Here is the answer. The reason why Orion Correlation Theory believers will never discuss research methods is because to do so would shed light on just how flawed their research methods and standards of evidence of the Orion Correlation Theory really are. The research methods and standards of evidence of the Orion Correlation Theory are so poor that real researchers reject those research methods as being invalid. A theory or set of ideas that are based on flawed research methods is just as flawed. Poor research methods produce poor research. Using invalid research methods produces falsehoods. The standards of evidence and research methods of the Orion Correlation Theory are so terrible that Orion Correlation Theory believers are ashamed to discuss this subject. Also, Orion Correlation Theory believers refuse to discuss research methods because they want to protect the falsehoods that their poor research has produced. Orion Correlation Theory believers think perceived precision validates a correlation. That is wrong in the realm of legitimate academic research. Orion Correlation Theory believers think math validates a correlation. That is wrong in the realm of legitimate academic research. Orion Correlation Theory believers think correlations do not need causation. That is wrong in the realm of legitimate academic research. Orion Correlation Theory believers use circular reasoning. That is wrong in the realm of legitimate academic research. Orion Correlation Theory believers make no distinction between high standards of evidence and low standards of evidence. That is wrong in the realm of legitimate academic research. Orion Correlation Theory believers have simply believed the story that the high priests of the Orion Correlation Theory mystery religion tell them. That is wrong in the realm of academic research. But the Orion Correlation Theory is not the only theory that has used very poor research methods. There are two other so-called theories that use the same exact flawed research methods as does the Orion Correlation Theory. Phrenology is a collection of correlations without causation. That theory used the same research methods as does the Orion Correlation Theory. Phrenology has been rejected because it is a collection of falsehoods produced using invalid research methods. Pyramidology, or as I call it, the biblical correlation theory, is a collection of precise correlations that people have come up with between the Great Pyramid and the Bible. Those precise Great Pyramid Bible correlations without causation were conjured up using the same invalid research methods as are used by the Orion Correlation Theory. Those precise Great Pyramid Bible correlations have been rejected by everyone except a few religious zealots because those fake correlations were conjured up using the same flawed research methods of the Orion Correlation Theory. So these three flawed theories are a trifecta of correlation without causation theories, which are all notable for their use of profoundly flawed research methods. The eventual fate of all theories that have been conjured up using hopelessly flawed research methods is rejection. Two of the trifecta of correlation without causation theories have already been resoundingly rejected. Currently, the Orion Correlation Theory is in crisis because it is based on the same flawed research methods and low standards of evidence used by the biblical correlation theory and the bump correlation theory, also known as phrenology. So there you have it. It was a fun series of questions that believers of the Orion Correlation Theory will not answer. The Orion Correlation Theory is destined for the ash heap of rejected ideas. It will find its resting place alongside the other two rejected correlation without causation theories as just another object lesson of how flawed research methods and low standards of evidence produces an invalid intellectual house of cards built on a foundation of logical fallacies. In the future, the Orion Correlation Theory will only be mentioned as an example of poor research methods run amok and something to avoid. Children will laugh at their parents who were duped into believing such a poorly conceived, fallacious theory riddled with logical fallacies. The Orion Correlation Theory is the phrenology of the modern age and will only be mentioned as part of a cautionary tale on what to avoid while conducting research. If you believe the Orion Correlation Theory, you are embracing falsehoods derived using poor research methods, and you are on the wrong side of history. I know this information may make some people mad or triggered, but I thank everyone for watching this video. For additional information on related subjects, please visit my YouTube channel, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. You will be glad you did. Like me on Facebook and follow me on Facebook. For lots more information about my upcoming radio interviews, check my website, www.thepump.org. All the links are in the description. If so inclined, read my books on the Great Pyramid. They are available on Amazon.com. All the links are in the description of this video. I also have produced 2 documentaries on the subject of the Great Pyramid. The links are in the description as well. If you need a guest for a radio interview, please contact me through my website at www.thepump.org or even message me on Facebook. If you know of a radio host who you think would like to have me as a guest, let them know about me. Watch the series of videos on how the Great Pyramid was assembled on my YouTube channel. I wish you the best on your journey for truth. May your research methods be valid and your standards of evidence high. Thank you for watching, and thank you, Harley, for your technical and emotional support while creating this video. Good evening.